This video was brought to you by Nebula. Earlier this month, Burkina Faso's new Prime Minister, Kayalem de Tambela, paid a visit to neighbouring Mali. On his trip, Tambela, a jurist appointed after a military coup back in late September of last year, made headlines when he proposed that Burkina Faso and Mali form a federation to become a, quote, powerhouse. While details are pretty thin on the ground, the idea was well received by Mali, and last week the two countries, joined by Guinea, held talks to discuss the issue. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at the prospective union, why the two countries are so keen on it, whether it could actually happen, and what this new country might actually look like. So before we get into why or how this federation might happen, let's just figure out what it would look like. Details are pretty thin on the ground at this point, but if Mali and Burkina Faso were to merge into one country, it would have a population of about 41 million people, and a territory covering about 1.5 million square kilometres, making it the 11th largest country in Africa by population and the 5th largest by size. If Guinea were to join as well, it would have a population nearer 60 million, the 5th largest in Africa, and a territory spanning about 1.8 million square kilometres, the 4th largest in Africa. Leaving Guinea out again, it would have a GDP of just under $40 billion, and a GDP per capita of about $800 per person. We can probably assume that the capital would be Bamako, the current capital of Mali, as it's the largest city in the region and Mali is slightly larger than Burkina Faso. There's no official name for this federation yet, but it'll probably be called something like the Union of Sahel States, instead of some aggressive portmanteau like Burkina Mali, Mali Faso or Malibu. So that's what it would look like. But why is this on the table at all? Well, the main reason is that both Mali and Burkina Faso are struggling to get a handle on jihadism in the Sahel, which has become significantly worse in the last few years, and they would probably think a federation would help. The number of people killed by jihadist-related terrorism in the Sahel has been steadily rising since the phenomenon first appeared in the late 2000s, but it's ticked up especially fast in the last couple of years. According to the African Centre for Strategic Studies, the number of people killed in violence linked to jihadist groups in Africa jumped by 48% in 2022 to at least 19,109, most of them in Somalia and the Sahel, especially Burkina Faso and central Mali. Unsurprisingly, this spike in jihadism has exacerbated political instability in these countries and pushed them in a damaging feedback loop. Essentially, incumbent governments are ousted for failing to deal with jihadism, usually via a military coup. But this only creates more political instability, which makes it easier for the jihadists, which usually means another military coup, etc., etc. This is what's happening in both Mali and Burkina Faso. In August 2020, the Malian military ousted the incumbent president, who'd been elected in 2013 and again in 2018 for failing to deal with the Islamist insurgency. Unsurprisingly, however, the new junta wasn't much better than the previous government, and after failing to get a handle on the jihadist problem, they were ousted again by another military coup in 2021, less than a year after the previous one. Similarly, in Burkina Faso, the military ousted their incumbent president, who was elected in 2015 and 2020, in January 2022, after he failed to deal with Burkina Faso's jihad problem. Again, the new military junta didn't fare much better, and it was kicked out of office by another military junta just 8 months later in September 2022. Similarly, both countries have expelled the French troops who were helping them and replaced them with mercenaries from the Russian Wagner group. But it turns out that Wagner aren't less effective than the French, which is one of the reasons that the number of jihadist incidents is still rising. Interestingly, in both countries, the public was originally supportive of the coup. Polling found that over 90% of respondents in Bamako, the capital of Mali, and about 50% of the respondents in Burkina-Faso, the capital of Burkina Faso, approved or strongly approved of military rule in early 2022. But that number has presumably waned as the military juntas have, like their democratic predecessors, failed to resolve the issue. Anyway, this is, as we see it, the main reason that the two countries are considering a union. The hope is that the greater military cooperation that would come with federalisation would allow them to better deal with jihadists. However, there is at least one other reason, and that's that it could be good for their economies. Burkina-Faso and Mali are two of the poorest countries in the world, each with a GDP per capita below $1,000 and poverty rates above 80%. On top of that, their new military juntas have been hit by a wave of post-coup sanctions. While the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, lifted its sanctions on Mali earlier last year, the US recently dropped Burkina Faso from its Trade Preference Programme, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which provides sub-Saharan African nations with duty-free access to the US. Growth in both countries is pretty stagnant. Orthodox economic theory will tell you that, if you become one country, standardization regulation and currency should make trade easier, and this should be mutually beneficial. When he pitched the idea earlier this month, Tambela also argued that the federation would be good for the two countries' economies, because they both export similar stuff, namely cotton, cattle and gold. And together they could become an export powerhouse. Anyway, you get the idea. A federation would, in theory, be good for these impoverished economies. So that's the rationale for this new country. But does this mean it'll actually happen? Well, no, probably not. For starters, neighbouring countries like Senegal aren't keen on the idea. Assuming it remains a military dictatorship, this new country, which would have a combined population of 41 million, would be Africa's largest dictatorship by population, and this would provoke some anxiety in its democratic neighbours. But the main reason it's still unlikely to happen is that neither country has the financial resources to carry out the tremendous effort of legal, regulatory, political and economic alignment required. Properly done, merging countries is an enormous bureaucratic task, and both countries are poor with limited state capacity. This is the main reason that similar efforts have failed in the past, and why most African countries have given up on redrawing their borders, even if they don't map onto Africa's ethnic divisions. In 1960, for example, Mali, then known as French Sudan, joined Senegal to form the Mali Federation, but it collapsed just 2 months later. A year later, Mali joined Ghana and Guinea to form the Union of African States in 1961, but it collapsed in 1963. Now, this doesn't mean it's impossible. Dictators can do this sort of thing, and Tambela actually explicitly stated that the union should take place before a return to democratic rule. Otherwise, the process would, quote, become tricky. Nonetheless, as things stand, this seems unlikely, at least in the near term. Mali, Burkina Faso and Guinea are just a few of the interesting places in the world that are often under-discussed. In fact, there are many fascinating places and countries around the world which you've maybe never even heard of.
So, our friends over at Wendover Productions have a whole series where they dive into how and why some of the world's most remote settlements exist. From remote communities in the middle of Australia to why one of Italy's most visited places is dying. That series, Extremities, is exclusively available on Nebula, the streaming service that we're building with a bunch of our creator friends, many of whom you likely already know and love. And if you sign up to Nebula, you'll find all of our videos ad-free and occasionally before they're even released on YouTube. On top of that, you'll also find a whole bunch of TLDR explainers available exclusively on Nebula, plus an extended version of our show, The Daily Briefing, every single weekday. As I say though, there's more than just TLDR on Nebula. There's a whole bunch of other original series that we know you'll love, like Real Life Law's Incredible Modern Conflicts, which breaks down contemporary disputes around the world, Neo's Underexposure, which runs through contentious and controversial topics you wish you'd always know more about, and of course Extremities. All of these things are exclusively available on Nebula, just like our extended daily briefings and a whole bunch of other exclusive TLDR content, which will never make it to YouTube. So if you want to sign up, the best way to do it is using our link in the description, which, with our special discount, gets you the whole service for just a couple of pounds a month. A couple of pounds which doesn't just go to some weird sponsor, but directly goes to educational creators like us. And that helps us out a whole lot, as does watching on Nebula more generally. So thanks for signing up, and we'll see you on Nebula.